fog rolled thick through Dorset Street that September morning, carrying with it the acrid smell of coal smoke and something far worse. Annie Chapman's body lay still in the narrow courtyard behind number 29, her possessions scattered like fallen leaves across the cobblestones. But among the investigators who gathered in that grey dawn light, none noticed the small figure watching from an upstairs window, a girl of perhaps 12, her face pale as parchment against the grimy glass. The child's name was Emily, and she'd been asking questions. Questions about the woman who used to slip her pennies for bread. Questions about the strange men who visited in the night. Questions that made the other residents of the lodging house whisper and cross themselves when shadows grew long. As the police carried Annie away on a rough wooden stretcher, Emily pressed her hand to the cold window. She knew things, terrible things, that would never find their way into Inspector Chandler's careful reports. The adults spoke of Jack the Ripper in hushed tones, but Emily had seen another face in the darkness. Now, as autumn mist swirled through London's forgotten corners, that face was searching for her. Chapter 1. The Girl at the Window. Good evening, and welcome. The night is quiet now, and the world has grown small. Let us drift backward in time to an era when gaslight flickered against cobblestone streets and shadows held deeper secrets than they do today. This is the Bedside Historian, and tonight we begin a journey into one of Victorian London's most haunting mysteries, a tale that begins with death, but leads us towards something far more complex, the story of a lost daughter whose very existence challenges everything we thought we knew about the autumn of terror in 1888. Wherever you find yourself listening tonight, perhaps beneath warm covers as rain patters against your window, or walking through quiet streets where modern street lamps have banished the darkness that once cloaked so many secrets, I invite you to close your eyes and let yourself be transported. If this story brings you comfort in the quiet hours, please consider subscribing to the Bedside Historian. It helps our channel grow and allows us to continue uncovering these forgotten corners of history, one story at a time. Now, let us step back through the veils of time to September of 1888, when London's East End trembled beneath an autumn that would forever change how the world understood evil itself. The fog hung like a burial shroud over Dorset Street on the morning of September the 8th, 1888. It was the kind of fog that seemed to rise not from the Thames, but from the very stones themselves, thick as porridge, yellow-grey with coal smoke and the 1,000 unnamed vapours that rose from the rookeries of Spitalfields. The narrow street, barely wide enough for 2 carts to pass, lay in perpetual shadow even on the brightest days. But this morning brought no brightness. The mist pressed against grimy windows and crawled along gutters thick with refuse, carrying with it the smell of unwashed bodies, stale gin, and something else. Something metallic and wrong that made even the rats scurry deeper into their holes. At number 29 Hanbury Street, the fog seemed to pool and thicken, as if drawn by some dark magnetism to the narrow passage that led to the backyard. Here, in a space no larger than a modest parlour, the cobblestones were wet with more than morning dew. Annie Chapman lay still against the wooden fence that separated the yard from the houses beyond, her body arranged with a terrible precision that spoke of something far beyond random violence. She had been 47 years old, though the harsh streets had aged her beyond her years. Her dark hair, once carefully pinned, now lay loose across her shoulders. Her hands, which had known work since childhood, first in domestic service, then in the various desperate employments that kept body and soul together in the East End, were pale and still. Around her, scattered like the remnants of a destroyed nest, lay the pitiful possessions that had comprised her worldly goods: a few pennies, a torn envelope, 2 pills wrapped in tissue paper, and a leather apron that would later puzzle investigators with its careful placement. The discovery came just after 6 in the morning, when John Davis, an elderly carman who lodged at number 29, made his way down the back steps toward the outside privy. The fog was so thick he nearly stumbled over the body before he saw it. His cry of alarm brought others running. Mrs. Richardson, the landlady, her son John, who helped manage the property, and several other lodgers who emerged from the building like disturbed spirits, their faces pale in the morning gloom. Word spread through the narrow streets with the speed that only tragedy possesses. Within the hour, Inspector Joseph Chandler of H Division had arrived, his constables forming a loose perimeter around the yard while he examined the scene with the methodical care that had earned him his position. Chandler was a veteran of the Metropolitan Police, a man whose 20 years of service had shown him humanity's capacity for evil in all its forms. Yet even his experienced eye seemed to pause longer than usual over certain details that morning, certain arrangements that suggested not merely murder, but something approaching ritual. Dr. George Bagster Phillips arrived shortly after 7, his medical bag in hand and his expression already grim. As the divisional police surgeon, Phillips had seen his share of violent death, but the autumn of 1888 was testing even his professional composure. This was the second such killing in less than 2 weeks, the first being Polly Nichols in Bucks Row, found on the last day of the August with injuries that had shaken even Scotland Yard's most seasoned investigators. As the officials went about their careful work, measuring, photographing, taking notes in their precise copperplate handwriting, none of them noticed the small face pressed against a grimy window 3 stories above. The window belonged to a cramped room at the very top of number 29, a space barely large enough for a bed and a washstand, rented by the week to those who could scrape together the few shillings required. The face belonged to a girl of perhaps 12, though malnutrition and worry had given her features a sharpness that made her seem both older and more fragile than her years. Emily Fairfax had been awake since before dawn, as she was most mornings. Sleep came uneasily in the lodging houses of Spitalfields, where walls were thin and neighbours were often drunk or violent or both. But this morning had been different. She'd heard voices in the yard below, not the usual sounds of residents stumbling home or making early departures, but something else. Urgent whispers that cut through even the thick fog. By the time she'd crept to her window and wiped a clear space in the grime, the voices had stopped. But something had made her remain there, watching, as the grey light of dawn slowly revealed the terrible scene below. Emily had known Annie Chapman, though not well. The woman had lodged at number 29 on and off for the past several months, when she could afford the bed and when the landlady would have her. Annie was what the residents called unfortunate, a woman who had fallen so far down the social ladder that only the most desperate expedients kept her alive. She had been married once to a coachman named John Chapman and had borne him 3 children. But drink had destroyed that life, as it destroyed so many lives in Victorian London. First her husband had died, then her children had been taken from her or had died themselves. Emily had heard different versions of the story from different lodgers, and the truth seemed to shift like the fog outside her window. What Emily knew for certain was that Annie Chapman had been kind to her. In a world where kindness was a luxury few could afford, Annie had occasionally slipped her a penny for bread, or shared a cup of tea when the night was cold. She had never asked Emily about her own circumstances, why a girl so young was living alone in one of London's worst districts, or where her family might be. Such questions were considered rude in places like Dorset Street, where everyone was running from something, and privacy was the only thing that cost nothing. Now Annie was dead, and Emily pressed her palm against the cold glass as she watched the police carry the body away on a rough wooden stretcher. The fog seemed to part briefly as they passed, revealing the woman's face one final time. Peaceful now, despite everything that had been done to her. Emily had seen death before. It was as common as hunger in the rookeries. But this felt different. This felt like a warning. The morning progressed with the strange mixture of routine and chaos that followed violent death in the East End. The police finished their examination and departed, taking their notes and their theories with them. The The lodgers gradually emerged from their rooms, clustering in small groups to whisper about what had happened and what it might mean. The landlady, Mrs. Amelia Richardson, busied herself with cleaning the yard, though she avoided the spot where the body had been found as if it might still carry some contagion. By afternoon, the fog had lifted enough to reveal the familiar squalor of Hanbury Street in all its depressing detail. The narrow buildings pressed together like crooked teeth, their brick facades stained black with soot and age. Washing lines stretched between the upper windows, though few residents owned enough clothing to make regular laundering worthwhile. Children played in the gutters despite their parents' half-hearted warnings, and women gathered at the street corners to share gossip and gin in equal measure. The newspapers would soon arrive with their dramatic headlines: "Another horrible murder in Whitechapel," and "The Fiend strikes again." But for now, the residents of Hanbury Street dealt with the tragedy in their own way. Some crossed themselves and muttered prayers. Others drank more heavily than usual. A few spoke of leaving the area entirely, though most knew they lacked the means to go anywhere else. Emily remained at her window long after the official activity had ended, watching the ordinary life of the street resume around the extraordinary violence that had occurred. She had learned to be invisible in places like this, a skill that had kept her alive and relatively safe since she had first arrived in London nearly 2 years earlier. But invisibility had another advantage. It allowed her to see things that others missed, to notice patterns that escaped adult attention. And Emily had been noticing things about Annie Chapman in the days before her death. Strange things that made her stomach tighten with worry now that she replayed them in her memory. 3 nights earlier, Emily had been returning from the 10 Bells public house, where she sometimes earned a few coins by running errands for the patrons, when she'd seen Annie talking to a man in the shadows near the entrance to Hanbury Street. The fog had been thick that night too, but not so thick that Emily couldn't make out the man's general appearance. He was well dressed by the standards of the neighbourhood. His coat appeared to be of good quality, and his boots were clean despite the muddy streets. But it was his manner that had caught Emily's attention. He stood very still while speaking to Annie, his head tilted slightly as if listening for something beyond their conversation. When he moved, he did so with a careful precision that seemed out of place among the rough movements of the East End's usual residents. Emily had ducked into a doorway and watched as the conversation continued for several minutes. She could not hear their words, but she could see Annie's gestures growing more animated, as if she were trying to convince the man of something. Finally, he had reached into his coat and withdrawn something, money Emily assumed, which he pressed into Annie's hand. Then he had turned and walked away, not toward the main thoroughfares where a gentleman might be expected to go, but deeper into the maze of narrow streets and courts that made up the worst parts of Spitalfields. The next night, Emily had seen the same man again, this time standing motionless in the shadows across from number 29. He had remained there for over an hour, occasionally pulling out a pocket watch to check the time. Emily had grown tired of watching and had gone to bed, but she had woken several times during the night with the feeling that someone was still out there, still waiting. Now, as she sat by her window in the grey afternoon light, Emily tried to remember every detail of the man's appearance. He had been of medium height and build, neither young nor old, perhaps 40 years of age. His hair appeared to be dark, though the poor light and his hat made it difficult to be certain. What she remembered most clearly was his stillness. Even the most patient men Emily knew, the pickpockets who waited hours for the right mark, the dock workers who stood in line hoping for day labour, carried some restlessness in their bodies. This man had possessed an absolute calm that struck her as somehow unnatural. The sound of footsteps on the stairs outside her room interrupted Emily's reverie. She recognised the heavy tread of Mr. Walker, who lodged in the room next to hers and worked nights loading cargo on the docks. His shifts typically began in the evening, which meant he should have been sleeping during the day. But like everyone else in the building, he had been disturbed by the morning's events. Emily heard him pause outside her door, and for a moment she feared he might knock. Mr. Walker had always been polite to her, but Emily had learned to be wary of adult men, even seemingly harmless ones. The pause stretched long enough to make her uncomfortable, but finally his footsteps continued down the hall toward his own room. As evening approached, and the fog began to thicken once again, Emily found herself thinking not just about what she had seen, but about what Annie Chapman might have told the mysterious man during their conversation. Annie had lived a hard life, but she had also been observant and intelligent beneath the rough exterior that poverty had given her. She knew the rhythms of the street, knew which sounds meant danger and which meant opportunity. If she had trusted the well-dressed stranger enough to meet with him repeatedly, she must have believed she had something valuable to offer him. But what could a woman like Annie Chapman have possessed that would interest a gentleman? She owned nothing of monetary value. Her few possessions had been pathetic even by the standards of Dorset Street. Her knowledge then, but knowledge of what? As Emily pondered these questions, the gaslight in the street below flickered to life, casting wavering shadows that seemed to dance with malevolent purpose. The lamplighter moved from post to post with practiced efficiency, but Emily noticed that he too glanced nervously at the passage that led to the backyard of number 29. Word of the murder had spread throughout Spitalfields by now, and everyone was looking over their shoulders. The night deepened, and Emily finally moved away from the window to light her own small candle. The room was cramped but clean. She had learned early that cleanliness was one of the few luxuries she could maintain regardless of her circumstances. A narrow bed took up most of the space, with a washstand and a small trunk that contained her few belongings occupying the rest. On the wall above the bed hung a small mirror, cracked along one edge, and beside it a faded photograph of a woman who bore a striking resemblance to Emily herself. The photograph had been her mother's, though Emily rarely allowed herself to think about the woman who had posed for it so many years ago. Some memories were too painful to examine in detail, and her mother's fate was among them. Instead, Emily focused on the practical concerns that governed her daily survival. Where to find work, how to avoid the attention of both criminals and well-meaning reformers, and most importantly, how to remain invisible in a world that seemed determined to either exploit or save young girls like herself. But tonight, as she prepared for sleep, Emily found her thoughts returning again and again to the image of Annie Chapman lying still in the courtyard below. Something about the woman's death felt personal, though Emily could not quite articulate why. Perhaps it was simply that Annie had been one of the few people in her current life who had shown her genuine kindness without expecting anything in return. Or perhaps it was the growing certainty that Annie's murder was connected to the mysterious meetings Emily had witnessed. As she blew out her candle and settled beneath her thin blanket, Emily made a decision that would change the course of her life in ways she could not yet imagine. Tomorrow, she would begin asking questions about Annie Chapman's final days. She would use her invisibility as a tool rather than just a shield, moving through the shadows of Spitalfields to uncover the truth that the police, for all their careful measurements and official reports, seemed destined to miss. The fog pressed against her window like a living thing, and somewhere in the distance a church bell tolled the midnight hour. Emily closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but her dreams were filled with images of a still figure standing in the shadows, waiting with inhuman patience for something that only he could see. The hunt for Annie Chapman's killer would consume the attention of London and the world in the weeks to come. But for now, in a cramped room above the scene of the crime, a 12-year-old girl held secrets that could reshape the entire investigation, if anyone had thought to ask her what she had seen. The darkness settled over Spitalfields like a familiar curse, and in that darkness, the truth waited to be discovered. Chapter 2. The Watchers in the Shadows. The morning after Annie Chapman's death brought no relief to the cramped quarters of Dorset Street. If anything, the narrow thoroughfare seemed to contract further upon itself, as though the very bricks and mortar sought to squeeze out the horror that had taken root within its boundaries. The fog that had shrouded the discovery of the body lingered well past dawn, creating a grey veil that transformed familiar landmarks into uncertain shapes and made every footstep echo with unnatural resonance. Emily Hartwell pressed herself against the grimy window pane of the second-floor lodging room she shared with 3 other working women. The glass felt cold against her forehead, a sharp contrast to the fever that had burned in her cheeks since she witnessed the removal of Annie's body. Below, the courtyard behind number 29 remained cordoned with rough rope, though the constables had long since departed with their notebooks and measuring sticks. Dark stains marked the cobblestones where Annie had lain, stains that the morning drizzle seemed unable to wash away. The child had not slept. How could she, when every time she closed her eyes she saw again that face in the darkness? Not the face the newspapers would soon plaster across their front pages, the grotesque caricature they called Jack the Ripper with his top hat and medical bag. No, Emily had seen something far more ordinary, and therefore infinitely more terrifying. A face she recognised, though she could not yet place where she had encountered it before. The other residents of the lodging house moved about their morning routines with an urgency born of fear. Mrs. Pembridge, the landlady, had already announced that the rent would be collected daily rather than weekly, claiming that the recent troubles made it necessary to maintain stricter control over who came and went. The pronouncement had caused considerable grumbling among the women, who depended on casual work to scrape together their pennies, but none dared voice their complaints too loudly. In the wake of Annie Chapman's murder, everyone understood that survival depended upon invisibility. Emily watched as Sarah Fleming emerged from the building below, her shawl pulled tight against the morning chill. Sarah had worked alongside Annie at the various establishments that dotted the area, peeling potatoes in public house kitchens or scrubbing floors for shopkeepers. She paused at the courtyard entrance, crossing herself quickly before hurrying away toward Commercial Street. The gesture struck Emily as both futile and heartbreaking, a desperate attempt to ward off evil that had already claimed its prize. The tolling of Christchurch bells marked the hour as 9, though the persistent fog made the morning feel trapped in perpetual twilight. Emily counted the chimes automatically, a habit instilled by the workhouse matrons who had governed her early years before circumstances deposited her in this corner of Spitalfields. Time had always been a luxury beyond her reach, measured not in minutes, but in the rumbling of an empty stomach or the ache of tired feet. Yet now, in the aftermath of Annie's death, each passing moment seemed weighted with significance. A movement in the building across the narrow street caught her attention. A curtain twitched in a first-floor window, revealing the pale oval of a face peering out. The figure withdrew quickly, but not before Emily recognised Mrs. Rosen, the elderly Jewish widow who took in piecework sewing to support herself and her grandson. Mrs. Rosen had lived on Dorset Street longer than most, arriving in the great wave of refugees who had fled the pogroms in Russia and Poland 2 decades earlier. If anyone understood the rhythms and secrets of this place, it would be her. Emily had spoken with Mrs. Rosen on several occasions, drawn by the woman's quiet dignity and the fascinating story she sometimes told of her homeland. The old woman possessed a keen intelligence that the harsh circumstances of her exile had never quite managed to extinguish. More importantly, she noticed things. Emily had often seen her at her window in the early morning hours, watching the street with the patient attention of someone who had learned that survival sometimes depended upon knowing who walked the shadows. The idea formed slowly in Emily's mind, taking shape like the fog outside her window. If Mrs. Rosen had been watching that night, she might have seen something. Perhaps not the killer himself, but some detail that could help Emily make sense of what she had witnessed. The child understood instinctively that approaching the police would be futile. Inspector Chandler and his men had no interest in the observations of a 12-year-old girl from the workhouse, particularly one who lived in the very building where murder had been committed. But Mrs. Rosen might listen. The morning wore on with agonizing slowness. Emily's fellow lodgers returned from their various errands and employment, speaking in hushed tones about the increased police presence throughout the district. Word had spread that plainclothes detectives were mingling with the crowds in the public houses and markets, hoping to catch some careless word that might lead them to the killer. The prospect made everyone nervous, for the line between witness and suspect was perilously thin in a place like Spitalfields. Mary Kelly, a young Irish woman who occupied the bed next to Emily's, brought news from the Ten Bells public house where she sometimes found work serving drinks. The establishment had been packed with reporters from the major London newspapers, all eager to purchase information about Annie Chapman's final hours. The landlord had grown rich overnight, selling details both true and fabricated to journalists who seemed incapable of distinguishing between fact and fiction. According to Mary, the stories being filed would paint Annie as everything from an innocent victim to a woman of the lowest moral character, depending upon which narrative better served each publication's particular readership. The transformation of Annie's death into commodity disturbed Emily more than she could articulate. She remembered the quiet kindness the older woman had shown her, the occasional penny pressed into her palm when hunger made concentration impossible. Annie had possessed her own struggles with drink and circumstance, but she had retained enough humanity to recognise suffering in others, now that complexity would be flattened into whatever caricature sold the most newspapers. As afternoon approached, Emily finally gathered the courage to cross the street. She descended the narrow staircase carefully, avoiding the loose board on the third step that would announce her departure to anyone listening. Mrs. Pembridge maintained strict rules about residents coming and going, ostensibly for everyone's protection, but primarily to ensure that rent could be collected promptly. Emily had no desire to explain her mission to the sharp-eyed landlady. The fog had thinned somewhat, revealing the familiar squalor of Dorset Street in harsh detail. Refuse littered the cobblestones, creating a treacherous landscape that required careful navigation. The air carried the mingled scents of cooking food, unwashed bodies, and the ever-present smoke from countless coal fires. It was a smell that permeated everything in this part of London, settling into clothing and hair until it became as much a part of a person as their shadow. Emily knocked softly on the door of Mrs. Rosen's lodging house, hoping the old woman would answer rather than one of the other residents. Fortune favoured her, for after a long moment, she heard the shuffle of careful footsteps approaching. The door opened just wide enough to reveal Mrs. Rosen's lined face, her dark eyes bright with intelligence despite her advanced years. Recognition dawned slowly, followed by concern. Mrs. Rosen glanced quickly up and down the street before opening the door wider and gesturing for Emily to enter. The interior of the building was marginally cleaner than Emily's own lodgings, though poverty had left its mark here as well. Mrs. Rosen led her to a small room on the ground floor where she conducted her sewing work, the space filled with carefully organised piles of fabric and thread. The old woman poured tea from a chipped pot, the liquid weak but warm. Emily accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping her small hands around it for comfort as much as warmth. Mrs. Rosen settled into her chair, her movements deliberate and economical. Age and hardship had taught her to waste nothing, including motion. For several minutes, they sat in comfortable silence. Mrs. Rosen had learned long ago that conversation often revealed more through what remained unspoken than through direct questions. Emily appreciated this restraint, for it allowed her to gather her thoughts and decide how much she dared reveal about what she had witnessed. Finally, Emily spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. She told Mrs. Rosen about seeing Annie's body discovered, about watching from her window as the police conducted their investigation. She described the face she had glimpsed in the shadows, though she remained deliberately vague about the circumstances. Throughout her account, Mrs. Rosen listened without interruption, occasionally nodding to encourage the child to continue. When Emily finished speaking, Mrs. Rosen was quiet for a long moment. Her fingers worked automatically at a piece of mending, the needle moving with the rhythm of long practice. Outside, the sounds of the street continued their familiar pattern, but within the small room, time seemed suspended. Mrs. Rosen finally looked up from her sewing, her eyes meeting Emily's directly. She had seen many things during her years on Dorset Street, she said carefully. People came and went, often under circumstances that defied easy explanation. The wise woman learned to observe without judging, to remember without speaking carelessly. But these recent events had disturbed the natural order of things in ways that concerned her deeply. She had indeed been at her window that night, unable to sleep due to the ache in her joints that always worsened with damp weather. She had seen figures moving in the shadows, though the fog had made identification impossible. What troubled her most was not what she had observed, but what had been absent. The usual rhythms of the street had been disrupted, as though some presence had altered the very atmosphere of the place. Mrs. Rosen's words carried weight beyond their literal meaning. Emily understood that the old woman was confirming her suspicions while maintaining the careful discretion that had allowed her to survive in this harsh environment. Together, they had acknowledged that something unnatural had visited Dorset Street, something that threatened the fragile equilibrium that permitted people like them to exist on the margins of respectable society. As evening approached, Emily prepared to return to her own lodgings. Mrs. Rosen pressed a small package into her hands, explaining that it contained bread and cheese left over from her midday meal. The gesture of kindness nearly brought tears to Emily's eyes, for it reminded her again of Annie Chapman's quiet generosity. The fog was returning as Emily crossed the street, rolling up from the Thames like a living thing. She climbed the stairs to her room carefully, her mind churning with everything Mrs. Rosen had shared. The old woman had given her no direct answers, but she had provided something more valuable: confirmation that her observations were not the product of a child's overactive imagination. That night, as her fellow lodgers settled into their narrow beds, Emily remained awake and watchful at the window. Somewhere in the labyrinthine streets of Spitalfields, a killer walked free, confident in his ability to strike again without consequence. But now he was being watched in return, observed by eyes that understood the true nature of the game being played in London's darkest corners. The hunt had begun in earnest, though few would have recognised the small figure at the grimy window as anything more than another casualty of Victorian London's indifference to its most vulnerable citizens. Emily Hartwell knew better, and in that knowledge lay both her greatest strength and her most terrible danger. Chapter 3. The Watchers in the Walls. The morning after Annie Chapman's discovery brought no respite to the narrow confines of Dorset Street. The autumn mist hung heavy between the blackened brick walls, carrying with it the perpetual stench of unwashed bodies, rotting vegetables, and the acrid smoke that poured endlessly from 1,000 chimneys across Spitalfields. In the common lodging house at number 29, the residents moved about their business with the peculiar mixture of morbid fascination and practiced indifference that marked those who lived always on the edge of catastrophe. Emily Whitmore pressed herself against the cracked window pane of the second-floor room she shared with 3 other unfortunates. Her breath fogged the grimy glass as she watched the last of the police constables disappear into the grey maze of Hanbury Street. The courtyard below, scene of such recent horror, had already begun to resume its usual function as a repository for refuse and human misery. A stray dog sniffed at the cobblestones where Annie Chapman's blood had pooled, while 2 women argued in harsh whispers over a torn piece of sacking. The child's pale fingers traced absent patterns on the window as her mind worked over the events she had witnessed in the hours before dawn. The other lodgers assumed she had been asleep when the commotion began, when the cries of murder had echoed through the narrow passages. They had not seen her crouched in the shadows of the stairwell, watching through the gaps in the wooden banister as figures moved like phantoms through the gaslit darkness below. Mrs. Hardwick, the deputy keeper of the lodging house, bustled about the common room with unusual energy, her grey hair escaping its pins as she swept imaginary dust from surfaces that had not seen a proper cleaning in months. The discovery of Annie's body had brought unwanted attention from the police, and such scrutiny was bad for business in a place where most residents preferred to remain invisible to the authorities. Her sharp voice cut through the morning gloom as she addressed the assembled lodgers. "There'll be no speaking to the newspapers, mind you all," she declared, brandishing her broom like a weapon. "Nothing good comes of having your name in print, especially not in connection with this nasty business. The police have asked their questions, taken their notes, and that's an end to it." The residents nodded with varying degrees of conviction. Most had little desire to attract official notice, carrying as they did the weight of debts, abandoned families, or minor crimes that had driven them to seek shelter in such desperate quarters. But Emily noticed how their eyes darted nervously toward the windows, how they spoke in hushed tones when they thought no one was listening. Fear had settled over the lodging house like a fog, and it was not merely fear of the unknown killer who stalked the streets of Whitechapel. Among the gathered faces, Emily recognised most of the regulars who had shared these cramped quarters through the long summer months. There was old Tom Pearson, whose hands shook perpetually from too much gin and too little food. Mary Sullivan sat in the corner, rocking slightly as she mended a torn petticoat with thread so thin it was barely visible. Young Jack Morrison, barely older than Emily herself, chewed nervously at his fingernails while staring at nothing in particular. But there were others present that morning who did not belong to the usual collection of society's discards. A well-dressed gentleman in a dark coat had spoken quietly with Mrs. Hardwick near the door, his voice too low for Emily to catch his words. Another stranger, a woman of middle years wearing clothes that suggested modest respectability, had questioned several of the lodgers about their knowledge of Annie Chapman's final days. These visitors moved with the careful authority of those accustomed to asking questions and expecting answers. Emily had learned to be invisible in places like this, a skill that had kept her alive through 2 hard years on the streets of East London. She possessed the peculiar gift of the truly desperate, the ability to observe without being observed, to listen without appearing to hear. As the morning wore on and the strangers departed with their notebooks full of carefully recorded testimony, she began to piece together fragments of a larger picture. Annie Chapman had not been merely another unfortunate soul selling herself for the price of a bed. Several of the lodgers spoke in whispers of her strange habits in recent weeks, how she'd taken to walking the streets at odd hours, not in search of customers, but as if she were watching for something. Mrs. Hardwick had noticed how Annie would sometimes stand motionless in the courtyard after dark, her head tilted as if listening for sounds that others could not hear. More disturbing still were the accounts of visitors who had come asking for Annie in the weeks before her death. Not the usual rough customers who frequented such establishments, but well-spoken individuals who seemed to know her by name. One lodger claimed to have seen a woman in morning dress climb the stairs to Annie's room late one evening, while another swore that a gentleman with a walking stick had inquired after her at the front door. Emily remembered these visitors because she had made it her business to watch the comings and goings of Dorset Street with the sharp attention of one whose survival depended on recognising potential dangers. Living rough had taught her to catalogue faces, to note unusual patterns in the endless flow of humanity that passed through the narrow streets of Spitalfields. In recent weeks, that catalogue had begun to include individuals who did not fit the usual categories of residents, customers, and petty criminals. The child's thoughts were interrupted by a commotion near the front entrance of the lodging house. Through the grimy windows, she could see a small crowd gathering in the street, their faces turned upward toward the building. Word of the murder had spread through Whitechapel with the speed that only truly shocking news could achieve, and the curious had come to stare at the place where Annie Chapman had spent her final night. Among the assembled gawkers, Emily spotted several familiar figures from her wanderings through the district. There was Maggie Fletcher, who sold matches on the corner of Thrall Street, her weathered face alive with the excitement that tragedy brings to those whose own lives hold little drama. Beside her stood the rag picker known only as Stumpy Joe, his cart of salvaged materials forgotten as he craned his neck to peer into the courtyard where the body had been discovered. But it was another face in the crowd that caused Emily's breath to catch in her throat. Standing slightly apart from the others, partially concealed by the shadow of a lamppost, was the same man she had seen speaking with Annie Chapman 3 nights before her death. He was of middle height and unremarkable appearance, the sort of person who could disappear into any London crowd without attracting notice. His clothes were neither fine nor shabby, his bearing neither aristocratic nor common. Yet something in his stillness, in the way he observed the lodging-house with patient attention, marked him as distinctly different from the casual spectators who had gathered to satisfy their morbid curiosity. Emily watched as the man's gaze moved methodically across the building's facade, pausing at each window as if cataloguing the inhabitants within. When his eyes reached her position on the second floor, she instinctively shrank back from the glass, though she was certain the grimy pane and her small stature rendered her invisible from the street. Still, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air seeping through the cracked window frame. The man remained in position for perhaps 10 minutes, his attention never wavering from the building. Then, with the same deliberate movements that had marked his arrival, he turned and disappeared into the maze of narrow streets that surrounded Dorset Street. Emily continued to stare at the spot where he had stood long after he vanished, her mind racing with questions she dared not voice aloud. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the grimy courtyard, Emily made a decision that would have seemed impossibly brave to anyone who understood the true nature of her circumstances. She resolved to follow the trail of questions that had begun to form in her mind, to seek answers to mysteries that the adult world seemed determined to ignore or suppress. The knowledge she possessed, fragments of conversations overheard, glimpses of faces that did not belong, the subtle patterns of behaviour that marked those who lived on society's margins, had begun to coalesce into something approaching understanding. That evening, as the lodging-house settled into its usual rhythm of quiet desperation and whispered conversations, Emily prepared to venture forth into the darkening streets of Whitechapel. She had learned to move through the nighttime city like a shadow, avoiding the notice of police constables and dangerous characters alike. Her small size and quick wits had served her well in the months since circumstances had forced her to make the streets her home, and she trusted these advantages to serve her again as she began her own investigation into the death of Annie Chapman. The fog was rising again from the Thames as Emily slipped through the rear entrance of the lodging-house, her bare feet making no sound on the damp cobblestones. Behind her, the windows glowed with the weak light of oil lamps and candle stubs, casting long rectangles of amber illumination across the narrow courtyard. Ahead lay the labyrinthine streets of East London, where answers waited in the shadows for those brave enough to seek them. She had seen the watchers in the walls, had felt the weight of eyes that observed without being observed. Now it was time to discover who they were, and why their attention had fallen so fatally upon a woman whose only crime had been asking too many questions of her own. The night embraced Emily Whitmore as she disappeared into its depths, another small figure in the endless drama of survival that played out each evening in the forgotten corners of Victoria's great metropolis. Chapter 4. The Keeper of Secrets. The bells of Christ Church struck 11:30 as Emily Hartwell pressed herself deeper into the shadows beneath the overhanging eaves of Thrall Street. The autumn rain had begun again, drumming against the slate roofs with the persistence of skeletal fingers tapping against coffin wood. Water dripped steadily from the broken guttering above, each drop catching what little gaslight filtered through the fog before disappearing into the oily puddles that reflected nothing but darkness. 3 days had passed since Annie Chapman's body had been discovered in that narrow courtyard. 3 days since Emily had witnessed the gathering crowd from her perch at the grimy window of Mrs. Kellerman's lodging-house. The image remained burned into her memory like a brand pressed into flesh. The way the constables had stood in their dark uniforms, the careful manner in which Inspector Chandler had examined the scattered possessions, the hushed conversations that carried up through the morning mist. But more vivid still was the recollection of that other figure, the one who had lingered at the edge of the crowd before melting away into the labyrinth of Whitechapel's narrow passages. Emily knew that face. She had seen it before in the weeks leading to Annie's death, glimpsed through the amber glow of tavern windows and caught in the brief flare of a struck match in doorways where decent folk feared to tread. The man moved through the district like smoke itself, appearing and vanishing with an ease that spoke of intimate knowledge of every alley, every hidden court, every forgotten staircase that honeycombed the ancient streets. The child pulled her thin shawl tighter against the October chill and stepped carefully across the slick cobblestones. Her destination lay 3 streets distant, where Flower and Dean Street curved like a question mark through the heart of the rookery. There, in a basement room that reeked of gin and unwashed bodies, lived Martha Watts, a woman whose tongue was as loose as her morals, but whose eyes missed nothing that transpired in the shadowed world of Whitechapel after dark. Martha had been Annie Chapman's friend, insofar as friendship could exist in a place where a shared meal might mean the difference between survival and starvation. The 2 women had often been seen together in the public houses that lined Commercial Street, their heads bent in whispered conversation over glasses of gin that promised temporary escape from the grinding poverty that defined their existence. If anyone knew the secrets that Annie had carried to her grave, it would be Martha. The narrow stairs that led to Martha's basement dwelling were treacherous with moisture and decades of accumulated filth. Emily descended carefully, her hand trailing along the damp brick wall for guidance. The air grew thicker with each step, heavy with the mingled odours of cooking grease, tobacco smoke, and human misery that seemed to seep from the very stones. Martha's door stood slightly ajar, revealing a slice of the cramped room beyond. Candlelight flickered against walls that had once been whitewashed, but now bore the stains of countless years and countless tears. The woman herself sat hunched over a small table, her fingers wrapped around a cracked teacup that Emily suspected contained something considerably stronger than tea. When Emily knocked softly against the doorframe, Martha's head lifted with the wariness of a creature long accustomed to danger. Her face, once perhaps pretty, bore the ravages of a life lived hard and without mercy. Deep lines carved paths from the corners of her eyes to her mouth, and her hair hung in greasy strands beneath a cap that had seen better decades. The woman's gaze fixed upon Emily with recognition tinged by something that might have been fear. Word travelled fast in these narrow streets, and Martha would have heard by now of the questions the child had been asking, the conversation she had been pursuing with a persistence that made the adults uncomfortable. Emily entered the room without invitation, closing the door behind her with quiet deliberation. The space was barely larger than a prison cell, furnished with little more than the table, 2 rickety chairs, and a narrow bed that served as both sleeping place and storage for Martha's meagre possessions. A small fire burned in the grate, casting dancing shadows across the walls and providing the only warmth against the October chill that seeped through every crack and crevice. Martha gestured toward the empty chair with a nod that conveyed both invitation and resignation. The woman had lived long enough in Whitechapel to understand that some conversations were inevitable, regardless of their danger. The child settled herself carefully, studying Martha's face in the wavering candlelight. Age was difficult to determine in this place where hardship aged faces prematurely, but Emily guessed the woman to be perhaps 40, though she might have been younger or older by a decade without surprising anyone. Their conversation began in the careful manner of 2 people testing the boundaries of trust. Martha spoke first, her voice roughened by years of gin and harsh living, asking after Emily's well-being with the sort of maternal concern that poverty could not entirely extinguish. The child responded with equal caution, inquiring about Martha's health and circumstances with the politeness that had been drilled into her by a mother who remembered better days. But beneath these social pleasantries lay the real purpose of Emily's visit, and gradually their words turned toward the subject that haunted both their thoughts. Martha's recollections of Annie Chapman painted a picture of a woman caught between worlds, 1 foot in the respectability she had once known as a soldier's wife, the other firmly planted in the desperate reality of Whitechapel's casual wards and common lodging houses. Annie had possessed what Martha called a gentleman's manner of speaking, evidence of her earlier life among people who owned more than they could carry and slept in beds that belonged to them alone. Even in her final months, When alcohol had claimed much of her former grace, Annie had retained certain habits that set her apart from the other unfortunates who populated the district's gin palaces and doss houses. According to Martha's account, Annie had been troubled in the weeks before her death by something beyond the usual concerns of finding shelter and scraping together the 4 pence required for a night's lodging. The woman had spoken of receiving letters, though from whom remained unclear. These communications had arrived at irregular intervals, delivered by a boy whose face Martha had never clearly seen, and whose origins remained as mysterious as the messages themselves. The content of these letters had been a source of considerable distress to Annie, though she had shared few details even with Martha. What emerged from their fragmentary conversations was a picture of obligations unfulfilled and secrets that carried weight far beyond the narrow confines of Dorset Street. Annie had spoken of a debt that could never be repaid, of promises made in better times that had somehow followed her into the abyss of her current circumstances. More troubling still were Annie's references to someone watching her, following her movements through the maze of Whitechapel streets with the patience of a hunter who knew his prey could not escape forever. This observer was not, according to Annie's fearful whispers, one of the usual predators who haunted these dark thoroughfares. The threat was more sophisticated, more patient, possessed of resources that suggested connections far beyond the rookery's borders. Martha paused in her narrative to drain the contents of her cup, and Emily noticed the tremor in the woman's hands as she set the vessel back upon the scarred wooden table. The candlelight flickered, casting their shadows larger and more menacing against the damp walls. The story continued with Martha's recollection of the final time she'd seen Annie alive. The meeting had taken place in the 10 Bells public house, that infamous establishment where Commercial Street met the northern boundary of respectability. Annie had arrived later than usual, her customary punctuality abandoned in favour of nervous glances toward the door and windows that fronted the busy thoroughfare. Their conversation that evening had been marked by Annie's obvious distraction and mounting fear. She had spoken of needing to leave Whitechapel, of finding passage to some distant place where her past could not follow. The notion was fantastical, given her circumstances, but Martha had recognised the genuine terror that drove such desperate planning. Annie had pressed a small object into Martha's hands that night, wrapped in a piece of brown paper and tied with string that had been knotted with unusual care. The package was to be kept safe, Annie had insisted, and given to a specific person only if something should happen to her. The recipient's name had been whispered so quietly that Martha claimed uncertainty about its exact pronunciation, though she believed it to be foreign, possibly German or perhaps Austrian. The object itself remained wrapped and hidden, secreted away in a place that Martha would not reveal, despite Emily's careful questioning. What she would share was her impression that the package contained something small and heavy, possibly metallic, that clinked softly when moved. Its significance remained as mysterious as its contents, though Annie's manner when entrusting it to Martha's care had suggested importance far beyond its size. As Martha's account drew toward its conclusion, Emily found herself studying the woman's face with new understanding. The fear she had initially attributed to general wariness about discussing Annie's death now revealed itself as something more specific and immediate. Martha was not simply reluctant to share information about her dead friend. She was terrified of the consequences that such sharing might bring. The realization prompted Emily to ask more direct questions about the mysterious observer who'd haunted Annie's final weeks. Martha's responses painted a picture that aligned disturbingly with Emily's own memories of the figure she had glimpsed at the edge of the crowd gathered around Annie's body. The man was well dressed by Whitechapel standards, though not so finely attired as to attract undue attention. His clothing suggested modest prosperity rather than wealth, the sort of deliberate respectability that allowed movement through various social circles without drawing particular notice. Most memorably, he possessed what Martha described as educated hands, clean, well-manicured, unmarked by the sort of manual labour that branded most men of the district. These hands had been particularly noticeable during the one occasion when Martha had observed the man directly. The encounter had taken place outside a chemist's shop on Commercial Road, where Martha had been waiting for a remedy for the persistent cough that plagued her during the colder months. The stranger had emerged from the shop carrying a small brown bottle, which he'd slipped into his coat pocket with the care of someone handling something precious or dangerous. Their eyes had met briefly across the busy street, and Martha had been struck by the intelligence she glimpsed there. This was not the dull cunning of a common criminal, or the fevered intensity of a madman, but something far more calculating and controlled. The man had studied her with the detached interest of a natural philosopher examining a specimen, noting her features and circumstances with clinical precision before moving away into the crowd. The memory of that encounter still troubled Martha's sleep, she confessed to Emily, as the candle burned lower and the shadows deepened around them. There had been something in the stranger's gaze that suggested he knew exactly who she was and what connection she bore to Annie Chapman. The implication was deeply unsettling, suggesting a level of observation and planning that extended far beyond casual interest. As the church bells struck midnight, Emily prepared to take her leave of Martha's basement refuge. The information she'd gathered painted a picture considerably more complex than the simple murder that had captured the attention of the penny press and the imagination of a terrified public. Annie Chapman's death was connected to something larger, something that reached back into her past and forward into dangers that still threatened those who had known her. The rain continued its steady percussion against the small window as Emily climbed the treacherous stairs back to street level. Behind her, Martha's candle was already guttering toward extinction, leaving the basement room to sink back into the darkness that was its natural state. The fog had thickened during Emily's visit, transforming the familiar streets into an alien landscape where familiar landmarks disappeared and reappeared like ghosts materializing from memory. Each footstep echoed strangely in the muffled air, and more than once Emily found herself glancing over her shoulder with the uncomfortable sensation that she was being followed. The package that Martha guarded so carefully would have to wait for another day, another conversation. But Emily carried with her now a clearer understanding of the forces that had surrounded Annie Chapman in her final weeks. The challenge that lay ahead was determining how to use this knowledge without falling victim to the same dangers that had claimed her friend. As she made her way back through the labyrinth of Whitechapel's ancient streets, Emily reflected on the weight of secrets and the price of knowledge in a world where truth could prove more dangerous than ignorance. The fog swirled around her like a living thing, and somewhere in its grey embrace, she sensed the presence of watching eyes that had marked her progress with the same clinical interest Martha had described. Chapter 5. The Watchers in the Walls. The lodging house at 35 Dorset Street breathed with the rhythm of restless sleep. In the hours between midnight and dawn, when the fog pressed against windows like grasping fingers, the building seemed to exhale secrets through its rotting timber and crumbling mortar. Emily pressed her ear to the thin wall that separated her cramped quarters from the room next door, listening to the whispered conversations that drifted through the darkness like smoke. 3 weeks had passed since Annie Chapman's body had been discovered in that narrow courtyard. 3 weeks since Emily had watched from her window as the police carried away the woman who had shown her small kindnesses. The lodging house had grown quieter in those weeks, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Fewer strangers knocked at the door in the deep hours of night. Fewer coins changed hands in the shadowed corridors. But Emily knew the silence was deceptive. She had learned to read the language of fear that now governed this place, to interpret the meaning behind nervous glances and hurried footsteps on the creaking stairs. The other residents moved through their daily routines like actors in a play, going through familiar motions while their eyes darted constantly toward windows and doorways. Mrs. Ringer, who managed the lodging house with an iron fist wrapped in threadbare wool, had grown particularly watchful. The stout woman's keys jingled more softly now as she made her evening rounds, and she no longer called out greetings to the tenants she encountered in the hallways. Instead, she moved like a cat through the building, her small eyes constantly scanning for signs of trouble. Emily had noticed how Mrs. Ringer's gaze lingered on certain tenants, particularly those who had been friendly with Annie Chapman in the weeks before her death. There was Mary Kelly, the Irish girl with the musical laugh who lived on the second floor. There was Elizabeth Stride, who sewed by candlelight in her window until the early hours of morning. And there was Catherine Eddowes, whose cough echoed through the walls like a death rattle in the quiet nights. These women moved through the lodging house like ghosts of themselves, their faces pale and drawn, their voices reduced to whispers. They huddled together in the common room, speaking in low tones about things Emily could only partially understand. They mentioned names that meant nothing to her, spoke of places beyond Dorset Street where other women had vanished or been found in terrible circumstances. The child had become invisible in their grief, a small shadow that moved through the building unnoticed. This invisibility had become her greatest advantage, allowing her to slip through doorways and crouch behind furniture, while the adults spoke of things they believed were too dangerous for young ears to hear. It was during one of these eavesdropping sessions that Emily first heard mention of the man with the walking stick. The women had gathered in Mary Kelly's room, their voices barely audible through the thin walls. They spoke of someone who had been seen in the area repeatedly in the days leading up to Annie's death, a gentleman who dressed well but whose presence in Dorset Street marked him as an outsider. The walking stick, they said, was ornate silver, with an unusual pattern carved into its head. One of the women claimed to have seen it catch the gaslight as its owner moved through the fog-shrouded streets. Another mentioned how the man seemed to know the layout of the area too well for a casual visitor, how he moved through the narrow passages and hidden courtyards with the confidence of someone who had studied the territory carefully. Emily's memory stirred as she listened to these whispered conversations. She remembered the figure she had glimpsed from her window on the night before Annie's death, remembered the distinctive silhouette of someone leaning heavily on what she had assumed was a walking stick. The image had been brief, barely a shadow against shadows, but something about it had lodged itself in her young mind. The following evening, Emily positioned herself at her window earlier than usual, pressing her face to the cold glass as darkness settled over the narrow street below. The fog rolled in thick and yellow, carrying with it the familiar cocktail of coal smoke, horse dung, and human misery that defined this corner of London. Gas lamps flickered weakly in the murky air, creating small pools of sickly light that seemed to emphasize rather than dispel the surrounding darkness. For hours, she watched the usual parade of late-night activity. Drunken men stumbled home from public houses, their voices echoing off the narrow walls. Women emerged from doorways to conduct their nocturnal business before disappearing again into the labyrinthine passages that connected one decrepit building to another. Police constables walked their beats with measured steps, their presence a thin comfort in the surrounding chaos. It was past 2 o'clock when Emily spotted the figure she'd been unconsciously searching for. A man emerged from the fog at the far end of Dorset Street, moving with purpose despite the late hour and treacherous conditions underfoot. Even from her elevated position, Emily could see that his clothing marked him as someone of means, his dark coat well tailored, and his hat of a quality rarely seen in this neighbourhood. But it was the walking stick that confirmed her suspicions. Even in the dim light, she could see how it caught the reflection of the distant gas lamps, its silver head gleaming like a beacon in the man's gloved hand. He moved with it not as someone who needed its support, but as someone who carried it as an accessory, a symbol of status and refinement. The man paused at the entrance to the narrow courtyard where Annie Chapman had been discovered. He stood perfectly still for several minutes, his head turned toward the spot where the body had lain. Emily felt her heart beating faster as she watched him, sensing something predatory in his stillness, something that reminded her of cats she'd seen stalking rats in the building cellar. Then, as if sensing her observation, the man looked up. His face was largely obscured by shadow and fog, but Emily caught a glimpse of pale features and dark eyes that seemed to search the windows above. She ducked back instinctively, pressing herself against the wall beside her window, hardly daring to breathe. When she finally gathered courage to look again, the man was gone, swallowed by the fog as completely as if he had never existed. But Emily knew with the certainty of childhood intuition that he would return, that his appearance in Dorset Street was not coincidental but part of some larger pattern she was only beginning to understand. The next morning brought news that sent fresh waves of fear through the lodging house. Another woman had been found dead, this time in nearby Berner Street. The details whispered among the residents were fragmentary but terrifying. Like Annie Chapman, the victim had been discovered in the early hours of morning, her body bearing wounds that spoke of deliberate violence rather than random street crime. Mrs. Ringer called an impromptu meeting in the common room, her face grave as she addressed the assembled tenants. Her voice carried none of its usual authoritarian bite as she spoke about increased security measures, about the importance of travelling in groups after dark, about reporting any suspicious activity to the authorities immediately. But Emily noticed how the older woman's eyes kept moving toward the windows as she spoke, as if she expected to see threatening figures lurking in the fog beyond. She noticed too how Mrs. Ringer's hands trembled slightly as she fingered the large ring of keys that hung from her belt. Keys that represented her control over this small domain, but which now seemed inadequate protection against whatever forces were at work in the darkness outside. The meeting dispersed, with residents returning to their rooms in subdued clusters, their conversations muted and anxious. Emily lingered in the common room, pretending to examine a tattered magazine while actually listening to the fragments of discussion that continued around her. She heard Mary Kelly mention that she had received a warning from someone she trusted, advice to avoid certain areas of Whitechapel altogether. Elizabeth Stride spoke of friends who had fled London entirely, seeking safety in distant cities where the shadow of these murders had not yet reached. Catherine Eddowes coughed repeatedly as she described her plans to find alternative lodging, somewhere far from Dorset Street, and its growing reputation as a place where women disappeared. But it was a comment from one of the older residents that caught Emily's attention most sharply. The woman mentioned seeing the same well-dressed gentleman with the silver walking stick on multiple occasions, always in the hours before dawn, always moving through the area with purposeful intent. She described how he seemed to study the buildings and their entrances, how he paid particular attention to the narrow passages and hidden courtyards that provided both privacy and vulnerability to their inhabitants. This revelation confirmed Emily's growing suspicion that the man she had observed was not simply a curious outsider, but someone with specific knowledge of the area and its residents. The walking stick, which had initially seemed like a mere affectation of wealth, now appeared to Emily as something more sinister, a tool that might serve purposes beyond mere support or social display. That evening, Emily made a decision that would have horrified any adult who knew of it. Instead of maintaining her usual vigil from the safety of her window, she crept down to the ground floor of the lodging house and slipped out into the fog-shrouded street. Her small size and intimate knowledge of the building's layout allowed her to avoid Mrs. Ringer's evening patrol, and soon she found herself standing in the narrow courtyard where Annie Chapman had met her end. The space felt different at night, smaller somehow, and filled with shadows that seemed to move independently of the flickering gaslight. Emily could smell the lingering traces of carbolic acid where someone had attempted to clean the cobblestones, but underneath that chemical sharpness lay something else, something that made her stomach clench with instinctive fear. She positioned herself behind a pile of refuse where she could observe the courtyard's entrance while remaining hidden from casual view. The fog provided additional concealment, wrapping around her small form like a damp blanket. Hours passed with only the usual sounds of night in Whitechapel, the distant clatter of late omnibuses, the occasional shout from a public house, the eternal drip of water from broken gutters. It was nearly dawn when her patience was rewarded. The man with the walking stick appeared at the courtyard entrance. moving with the same purposeful stride she had observed from her window. But now, seeing him at ground level, Emily could discern details that had been invisible from above. His face, partially revealed by the growing light, showed features that were refined but cold, with eyes that surveyed the courtyard with clinical detachment. His clothing, though expensive, bore subtle signs of wear that suggested he was not as wealthy as he wished to appear. Most significantly, the walking stick in his hand bore intricate carvings that seemed to depict scenes of violence, images that made Emily's young mind recoil with horror. As she watched, frozen with fear and fascination, the man methodically examined the courtyard, paying particular attention to the angles of visibility from surrounding windows and the various routes of escape. He moved like someone conducting a scientific experiment, taking mental notes that would serve some future purpose. Emily remained perfectly still until the man finally departed, disappearing once again into the fog with the same ghostly completeness that had marked his previous appearances. Only then did she allow herself to breathe normally, to acknowledge the full extent of what she had witnessed. She now understood with terrible clarity that the deaths in Whitechapel were not random acts of violence but carefully planned events, orchestrated by someone who studied his targets with methodical precision. The man with the walking stick was not merely a curious observer, but an active participant in the growing reign of terror that had settled over their neighbourhood like a suffocating shroud. As Emily crept back toward the lodging house, the first rays of sunlight beginning to penetrate the fog, she carried with her knowledge that would forever change her understanding of the adult world and its capacity for deliberate evil. She'd seen the face of calculated malice, and that face would now visit her in dreams and waking moments alike, a reminder that monsters were not creatures of fairy tales, but real beings who walked among the innocent, hunting with patience and terrible intelligence. The fog began to lift as she reached the building's entrance, revealing a world that looked the same as always, but felt fundamentally altered by what she had witnessed in those dark hours before dawn. Chapter 6. The Paper Trail. The gaslight flickered against the rain-streaked window of Inspector Frederick Abeline's cramped office in Commercial Street Police Station, casting dancing shadows across the growing collection of reports that covered his desk like autumn leaves. 3 weeks had passed since Annie Chapman's murder, and still the case files multiplied with each dawn, each witness statement, each theory that led nowhere but deeper into the labyrinth of Whitechapel's secrets. Abeline lifted his spectacles and rubbed his tired eyes. The clock on the mantelpiece showed 11:30 in the evening, its brass pendulum marking time with mechanical precision, while outside, the rain drummed against the cobblestones with the persistence of a funeral march. He had been poring over the testimonies again, searching for patterns in the chaos, looking for the thread that might unravel the mystery that had consumed his waking hours and haunted his dreams. The official reports painted a clear enough picture of Annie Chapman's final hours. She'd been seen alive at approximately 5:30 on the morning of September 8th, speaking with a man outside number 29 Hanbury Street. By 6 o'clock, her mutilated body had been discovered in the narrow yard behind the house. The post-mortem examination had revealed the methodical precision of her killer, the surgical knowledge that had already begun to fuel wild theories about the identity of the man the newspapers had dubbed Jack the Ripper. But Abeline knew that official reports, like photographs, captured only surface truths. They recorded facts, but missed the subtle currents that flowed beneath the visible world, the connections that existed in whispered conversations and meaningful glances, in the spaces between words where secrets lived and died. It was Mrs. Elizabeth Richardson who had first mentioned the child to him, almost as an afterthought during her second interview. She had been describing the morning she'd discovered Annie's body, recounting how she'd gone to the yard behind number 29 to check the cellar door, when something in her manner suggested she was holding back information. Abeline had learned to recognise that particular hesitation in witnesses, the way their voices grew careful when they approached something they were reluctant to share. When pressed gently, Mrs. Richardson had finally admitted that she had noticed a young girl watching from an upstairs window as the police worked their grim business in the yard below. The child had stood motionless behind the grimy glass, her pale face framed by tangled hair, her expression unnaturally solemn for one so young. Mrs. Richardson had thought little of it at the time, assuming the girl was simply one of the many children who crowded into the lodging houses with their families, drawn by morbid curiosity to witness the drama unfolding in their courtyard. But other witnesses had mentioned the child as well, once Abeline began asking specific questions. Thomas Bowyer, who worked as a street sweeper in the area, recalled seeing a young girl of perhaps 12 years speaking earnestly with Annie Chapman on several occasions in the weeks before the murder. The conversations had struck him as unusual, not because of their frequency, but because of their apparent intensity. The child would approach Annie with urgent whispers, and the older woman would listen with the kind of serious attention usually reserved for adult concerns. Mary Cox, who sold flowers near Spitalfields Market, remembered the same girl asking questions about Annie in the days following the murder. The child had approached her stall with a gravity that seemed far beyond her years, inquiring about Annie's habits, her regular customers, the men she was known to associate with. When Mary had asked why she wanted to know such things, the girl had simply walked away, disappearing into the maze of narrow streets like smoke dispersing in the wind. The more Abeline investigated, the more convinced he became that this mysterious child held pieces of the puzzle that had so far eluded him. But tracking down a nameless girl in the shifting population of Whitechapel's lodging houses proved more challenging than pursuing the usual suspects. Children moved through the district like ghosts, appearing and disappearing according to rhythms that followed neither the law nor conventional adult understanding. His inquiries had eventually led him to Mrs. Sarah Fleming, who managed one of the larger common lodging houses on Thrall Street. Mrs. Fleming was a stout woman in her 50s, whose weathered face bore the marks of someone who had seen too much of life's cruelty to be easily shocked. She kept careful records of her lodgers, partly from natural inclination toward order, and partly because the police regulations required it. When Abeline described the girl he was seeking, Mrs. Fleming's expression had grown thoughtful. She remembered a child fitting that description who had stayed at her establishment for several weeks during the summer, paying her 4p each night for a bed in the women's dormitory. The girl had given her name as Emily Watson, claiming to be an orphan recently arrived from the countryside in search of work. She'd been polite and quiet, causing no trouble, but there had been something unsettling about her presence that Mrs. Fleming struggled to articulate. The child had possessed an adult's watchfulness, observing the other lodgers with the calculating gaze of someone taking careful mental notes. She asked few questions but seemed to absorb every conversation, every piece of gossip, every fragment of information that circulated through the crowded rooms. Mrs. Fleming had noticed that Emily showed particular interest whenever the conversation turned to the local unfortunates who worked the streets, listening intently to discussions about their habits, their territories, their relationships with clients and associates. Most troubling of all, Emily had disappeared from the lodging house on September 7th, the night before Annie Chapman's murder. Mrs. Fleming had noticed her absence at the evening meal, but assumed the girl had simply moved on to another establishment, as lodgers frequently did when their circumstances changed, or when they grew tired of a particular location. It was only in retrospect, after hearing about the murder, that the timing struck her as significant. Abeline had spent days following Emily's trail through the network of lodging houses, common kitchens, and charitable organisations that served Whitechapel's transient population. The picture that emerged was fragmentary but consistent. Emily Watson, if that was indeed her real name, had arrived in the district sometime in early July. She was remembered as unusually intelligent for her apparent age and circumstances, able to read and write with facility that suggested some formal education. Several witnesses recalled her asking detailed questions about specific individuals in the area, particularly women who worked the streets. At the 10 Bells public house, The barmaid remembered Emily sitting quietly in corners, nursing a single glass of gin for hours while listening to conversations around her. The girl had shown particular interest in discussions about Annie Chapman, though she never participated directly in these conversations. Instead, she would arrive when Annie was expected, position herself where she could observe without being noticed, and watch the older woman's interactions with systematic attention. Dr. George Bagster Phillips, the divisional police surgeon who had performed Annie's post-mortem examination, had initially dismissed Abeline's theory about the child's significance. The murder showed clear evidence of anatomical knowledge, he argued, suggesting a perpetrator with medical training or experience in butchery. The idea that a 12-year-old girl might possess crucial information about such a crime seemed to stretch credibility beyond reasonable limits. But as Abeline shared more details about Emily's behaviour and apparent knowledge, Dr. Phillips grew more thoughtful. The child's systematic observation of Annie's habits suggested someone gathering intelligence for a specific purpose. Her disappearance on the eve of the murder was too convenient to be mere coincidence. Most intriguingly, her apparent education and articulate speech pattern suggested she did not belong naturally to Whitechapel's underworld, raising questions about what had brought her to the district and whom she might be working for. The investigation had taken an even more troubling turn when Abeline discovered that Emily had been asking questions about other women besides Annie Chapman. Martha Tabram, who had been murdered in George Yard just weeks earlier, had also drawn the girl's attention. Several witnesses recalled seeing Emily near Martha's usual haunts, in the days before that killing as well, observing with the same methodical intensity she had later shown toward Annie. The pattern suggested a level of premeditation that chilled Abeline's professional soul. If Emily was indeed connected to both murders, it implied that the killings were not the random acts of a madman, as many had assumed, but carefully planned executions carried out with specific targets in mind. The surgical precision of both crimes suddenly took on new significance, suggesting not just anatomical knowledge but deliberate methodology. Abeline had begun mapping Emily's movements and interests against the broader pattern of violence in Whitechapel, looking for connections that might have been missed in the initial investigations. The exercise revealed disturbing correlations between the girl's presence and several other incidents of violence against women in the area, though none as dramatic as the murders that had captured public attention. As October's chill settled over London's East End, Abeline found himself pursuing shadows through fog-shrouded streets, following leads that seemed to dissolve like morning mist when examined too closely. Emily Watson had vanished as completely as if she had never existed, leaving behind only fragments of memory and troubling questions that multiplied rather than resolved with each passing day. The official investigation continued along its established lines, focusing on the medical evidence, the geographical patterns of the crimes, and the usual suspects who populated police files. But Abeline knew that somewhere in Whitechapel's maze of narrow streets and overcrowded tenements, a young girl with old eyes and dangerous knowledge was moving through the shadows, carrying secrets that might illuminate the darkest corners of the most notorious crimes in London's bloody history. The rain continued its relentless percussion against his office window as Abeline returned to his files, searching once again for the clue that would lead him to Emily Watson and the truth she represented. Outside, the city slept fitfully, while in its forgotten corners, predators and prey continued their ancient dance, watched by eyes that saw everything and revealed nothing. Chapter 7. The Watchers in the Shadows. The morning after Annie Chapman's burial brought no peace to the narrow streets of Spitalfields. October rain drummed against the grimy windows of the lodging houses, each drop carrying with it the promise of a long, bitter winter. In the cramped quarters above the 10 Bells public house, Emily Hartwell pressed her thin frame against the cold glass, watching the steady procession of constables who continued their futile searches through the maze of courtyards and alleyways below. 3 weeks had passed since that terrible September dawn when she had witnessed the discovery of Annie's broken body. 3 weeks of questions whispered in dark corners, of suspicious glances cast toward anyone who lingered too long in doorways. of children hurried indoors before the lamplighters made their rounds. The newspapers spoke of Jack the Ripper with increasing hysteria, their headlines growing bolder with each passing day. But Emily knew the truth lay buried deeper than any journalist dared to dig. The child had learned to move through Dorset Street like smoke itself, slipping between the shadows cast by overhanging buildings, listening to conversations that adults thought safely hidden behind closed doors. Her small stature and unremarkable appearance made her nearly invisible to the world of grown folk, a quality that had served her well in the weeks following Annie's death. While Inspector Chandler and his men questioned the obvious suspects, Emily had been conducting her own investigation, gathering fragments of truth like a magpie collecting shiny objects. She had discovered that Annie Chapman's last days had been more complex than the official report suggested. The woman who had shown her such small kindnesses had been entangled in a web of debts and desperate bargains that stretched far beyond the common lodging houses of Whitechapel. Emily had heard whispers of money owed to men who operated from the genteel districts north of the Thames, men whose influence reached into the very heart of London's commercial empire. The rain continued its relentless assault against the window as Emily recalled the conversation she had overheard 2 nights previous. Hidden beneath the wooden stairs of Mrs. Richardson's lodging house, she had listened as 2 men spoke in hushed tones about Annie's final weeks. Their voices carried the refined accents of education, yet their words held a coldness that made Emily's blood run like winter streams through her veins. The first man had spoken of a ledger, bound in brown leather, that contained records of transactions dating back several years. Annie had apparently come into possession of this book through circumstances that neither man seemed willing to discuss in detail. The second voice, older and more gravelly, had mentioned names that Emily recognised from the newspapers, members of Parliament, prominent merchants, even clergy who preached from the pulpits of fashionable churches in the West End. As the 2 men had concluded their conversation and departed into the foggy night, Emily had emerged from her hiding place with a new understanding of the forces that had led to Annie's destruction. The woman had not simply been the victim of a madman's random violence, but rather the casualty of a much larger game played by men who moved in circles far removed from the squalor of Spitalfields. The following days had brought new revelations as Emily expanded her nocturnal wanderings. She had learned to time her movements with the rhythms of the night watch, slipping past the constables who patrolled the main thoroughfares with predictable regularity. In the warren of interconnected cellars beneath the old silk warehouses, she had discovered evidence of gatherings that occurred well after midnight, when honest folk lay sleeping in their beds. These assemblies brought together men whose faces Emily recognised from her daylight observations around the markets and commercial districts. Respectable gentlemen who conducted their legitimate business in the hours of sunshine transformed into something altogether more sinister when cloaked in darkness. She'd witnessed exchanges of money and documents, heard discussions of activities that would have scandalised their wives and business associates, seen evidence of appetites that could never be satisfied through conventional means. The leather-bound ledger that had sealed Annie Chapman's fate contained meticulous records of these nocturnal transactions. Emily had learned that Annie had acquired the book through her connection with a man named Thomas Hartwell, a name that had caused Emily's heart to race with recognition. The surname matched her own, though she had been too young when placed in the workhouse to retain clear memories of her family connections. Further investigation had revealed that Thomas Hartwell had worked as a clerk for a shipping company that operated from the London docks. His position had given him access to information about cargo manifests and passenger lists, knowledge that proved valuable to certain individuals who preferred their movements to remain unrecorded by official authorities. When Hartwell had died in a workplace accident the previous spring, his few possessions had been distributed among the residents of his lodging house, with the ledger passing to Annie Chapman through circumstances that seemed more than coincidental. Emily had come to understand that Annie's death represented not just the elimination of a potential threat, but also the conclusion of a carefully orchestrated plan to recover the damaging evidence contained within those leather-bound pages. The woman's final weeks had been marked by increasing desperation as she attempted to negotiate her way out of the deadly trap that had been closing around her. The child's investigation had also revealed the existence of others who possessed knowledge of the activities recorded in Hartwell's ledger. A former ship's captain named Morrison had been found dead in his Thameside lodgings just days before Annie's murder. His death attributed to natural causes despite his relatively young age. A dock worker named Fleming had disappeared entirely, leaving behind only debts and questions that no one seemed interested in pursuing. As October deepened and the nights grew longer, Emily began to notice signs that her own activities had not gone unobserved. Men in well-tailored coats had begun appearing with suspicious frequency in the vicinity of her lodgings. Their faces remained partially concealed beneath the brims of expensive hats, but their eyes held a watchfulness that made Emily's skin crawl with apprehension. The realization that she had become a target brought with it a new understanding of the precarious nature of her situation. The knowledge she had accumulated about Annie Chapman's death made her dangerous to powerful men who would not hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatened their carefully constructed facades of respectability. Emily understood that her youth and apparent innocence provided only the thinnest protection against forces that had already demonstrated their willingness to commit murder. She had begun to vary her routes through the labyrinthine streets, changing her patterns of movement to avoid establishing any predictable routines. Her small cache of coins, saved from months of careful scavenging and occasional employment, had been hidden in multiple locations to prevent total loss if her primary refuge was discovered. Most importantly, she had begun to document her findings in careful script on scraps of paper that she concealed in places known only to herself. The autumn rain continued to fall as Emily contemplated her next course of action. The official investigation into Annie Chapman's murder had reached what appeared to be a permanent standstill, with Inspector Chandler's men no closer to identifying the killer than they had been on that first grey morning. The newspapers continued to publish sensational accounts of the Ripper's activities, but their focus on the more theatrical aspects of the crimes had effectively obscured the more complex truth that Emily had begun to uncover. She knew that the leather-bound ledger remained hidden somewhere in the maze of Spitalfields, waiting to be recovered by those who would use its contents to continue their deadly work. The men who had orchestrated Annie's death would not rest until they had secured the evidence that threatened to expose their activities to the harsh light of public scrutiny. Emily also understood that her growing knowledge of these matters made her an increasingly valuable prize for those same forces. The sound of footsteps on the wooden stairs outside her room caused Emily to step back from the window. The measured tread was unfamiliar, heavier than that of the other lodgers, and accompanied by a subtle creaking that suggested boots of superior quality to those typically worn by residents of such establishments. She pressed herself against the wall beside the door, controlling her breathing as the footsteps paused directly outside her threshold. A gentle knock echoed through the thin wood, followed by a voice that carried the refined tones of education and privilege. The speaker identified himself as a representative of charitable organisations, expressing concern for the welfare of children who might have been affected by the recent tragedies in the district. His words were carefully chosen, designed to inspire trust and cooperation, but Emily detected the underlying current of threat that flowed beneath his civilised veneer. As the minutes passed and Emily remained silent within her room, the visitor's patience began to show signs of strain. His knocking became more insistent, his voice taking on an edge that revealed the true nature of his intentions. When no response came from within, Emily heard him testing the door handle with increasing boldness, discovering that her simple bolt provided the only barrier between herself and whatever purpose had brought him to her threshold. The sound of metal tools being employed against the lock mechanism sent Emily into motion. She had prepared for such a moment, creating an escape route that led through a loosened board in the rear wall of her chamber. As the door began to give way behind her, she squeezed through the narrow opening and dropped onto the slanted roof of the building's rear extension. The autumn rain had made the slate tiles treacherous, But Emily's months of nocturnal wandering had taught her to move with the confidence of a creature born to such precarious terrain. She made her way across the interconnected rooftops, listening to the sounds of pursuit that echoed from the room she'd just abandoned. Multiple voices now called out in frustration, their refined accents stripped away to reveal the crude determination that drove their actions. As she reached the safety of a distant rooftop, Emily paused to catch her breath and consider the implications of this latest development. The men who had murdered Annie Chapman were clearly aware of her investigation and had decided that she posed a sufficient threat to warrant direct action. Her childhood was effectively at an end, replaced by a deadly game of survival that would test every skill she'd acquired during her months of living by her wits alone. The rain continued to fall across the sprawling expanse of London's East End, washing the blood and sorrow of countless tragedies into the dark waters of the Thames. Somewhere in the maze below, powerful men plotted the elimination of anyone who threatened to expose their carefully guarded secrets. Emily Hartwell, alone on her rain-soaked perch above the city, understood that she'd become the keeper of truths that others would kill to suppress. The shadows of night were beginning to gather around her once again. Chapter 8. The Keeper of Secrets. The bells of Christ Church. Spitalfields tolled 8 times through the October morning mist as Emily pressed her thin frame against the brick wall of Flower and Dean Street. 3 weeks had passed since Annie Chapman's death, and the girl had learned to move like smoke through the narrow passages of Whitechapel. The lodging houses knew her now as a shadow, a whisper of movement that appeared and vanished before questions could be asked. Her fingers clutched the small leather pouch that hung beneath her threadbare dress, containing the few shillings she had earned running errands for the costermongers at Spitalfields Market. The coins represented more than mere copper. They meant another night with a roof overhead, another dawn where she might wake without frost in her hair. Yet Emily knew that safety in these streets was as fleeting as morning fog, and the face she'd glimpsed in the darkness of Dorset Street haunted her sleeping and waking hours alike. The newspaper sellers had grown hoarse, crying their headlines about the Ripper's latest outrage. Mary Ann Nichols in Bucks Row, Annie Chapman in Hanbury Street. The whole of London seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next terrible dawn. But Emily carried knowledge that weighed heavier than the morning papers, knowledge of a different kind of monster, one whose hunger was not for blood alone, but for the silence of those who had witnessed his true nature. She moved carefully through the maze of alleyways that connected the various lodging houses and common kitchens of the district. The October air carried the familiar perfume of Whitechapel, boiled cabbage and gin, coal smoke and human misery, the sweet decay that rose from the Thames when the wind turned eastward. These scents had become the geography of her existence, marking the boundaries of a world that extended no further than a man could walk in an hour. At the corner of Thrall Street, Emily paused beneath the grimy window of a public house called the 10 Bells. Inside, she could hear the low murmur of morning drinkers, men and women who had found their breakfast in gin and their courage in numbers. The establishment had become something of a gathering place for those who lived on the margins of respectability, and Emily had learned that information flowed as freely as spirits within its smoke-stained walls. She slipped around to the narrow passage that ran behind the building, where empty barrels and broken furniture created a maze of hiding places. From here she could observe the comings and goings of the public house without being seen herself. It was a skill she had perfected in the weeks since Annie's death, the art of watching without being watched, of listening without being heard. The morning light filtered weakly through the perpetual haze that hung over this part of London, casting everything in shades of grey and brown. The buildings seemed to lean inward, as if the weight of human suffering had bent their very bones. Washing lines stretched between the upper windows like spider webs, hung with garments that would never quite come clean no matter how many times they were scrubbed in the communal sinks. Emily had witnessed the subtle changes that had crept through the district since the murders began. Women walked in pairs now, even in daylight. The lodging house keepers had grown more suspicious, demanding to know the business of anyone who lingered too long in their common rooms. Children like herself had become even more invisible, if such a thing were possible, as adults focused their attention on threats that wore the faces of grown men. Yet the girl knew that danger could wear many masks. The man she'd seen in the shadows of Dorset Street had not looked like the slavering beast that the penny papers described. He had been well-dressed, soft-spoken, the sort of gentleman who might tip his hat to a lady on the street. It was this very ordinariness that made him so terrifying, for if evil could hide behind such a facade, then no one could be trusted. The sound of approaching footsteps caused Emily to shrink deeper into her hiding place among the barrels. A woman emerged from the rear entrance of the 10 Bells, her movements unsteady with drink despite the early hour. Emily recognised her as Polly Palmer, a frequent resident of the various lodging houses who earned her living through means that were whispered about rather than spoken aloud. Polly paused in the narrow passage, swaying slightly as she fumbled in her pockets for something. Her face bore the marks of hard living, premature lines round her eyes, a pallor that spoke of too many nights spent in gin palaces and too few meals taken at proper hours. Yet there was a cunning in her expression that suggested a mind still sharp beneath the fog of alcohol. As Emily watched, another figure approached from the opposite end of the passage. This newcomer wore the dark clothing of a tradesman or clerk, his boots polished despite the muddy streets. There was something familiar about his silhouette that made Emily's heart begin to race, though she could not yet see his face clearly in the dim morning light. The two figures met in the centre of the passage, and Emily strained to hear their conversation over the ambient noise of the awakening city. Their voices were low, urgent, carrying the weight of secrets that could not be spoken in daylight hours. The man pressed something into Polly's hand, coins by the soft chinking sound they made, and received a small object in return. It was then that the man turned slightly, and Emily saw his profile illuminated by a shaft of pale sunlight that had found its way between the buildings. Recognition struck her like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs and setting her hands to trembling. This was the face that had haunted her dreams, the same features she had glimpsed in the shadows of Annie Chapman's final dwelling place. The man spoke a few more words to Polly, his tone carrying an undertone of menace despite its quiet civility. Emily caught only fragments of their exchange. Something about keeping silent, about forgetting faces, about the wisdom of discretion in these dangerous times. Then he was gone, melting back into the labyrinth of streets with the practiced ease of one who knew these passages well. Polly remained in the passage for several minutes after his departure, studying the object he'd given her. In the growing daylight, Emily could see that it was a small photograph, the kind that might be taken in one of the portrait studios that catered to the working classes. Polly's expression as she examined the image was unreadable, a mixture of fear and calculation that suggested she understood the full implications of what she held. The woman eventually tucked the photograph into her bodice and made her way back toward the street, but not before glancing around the passage with the wariness of a hunted animal. For a moment, her eyes seemed to linger on the shadows where Emily crouched, and the girl held her breath until Polly finally disappeared around the corner. Emily remained hidden for a long while after both figures had departed, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of what she had witnessed. The photograph suggested some form of blackmail or coercion, though the exact nature of the relationship between the man and Polly remained unclear. What was certain was that this same man had been present in Dorset Street on the morning of Annie Chapman's death, and his continued presence in the district boded ill for anyone who might have witnessed his activities. The girl knew that she possessed dangerous knowledge, but she also understood that her youth and apparent insignificance were her greatest protections. Adults rarely paid attention to children in these streets, dismissing them as part of the landscape like the stray cats and mongrel dogs that scavenged for survival. This invisibility had allowed her to observe and remember, to piece together fragments of a larger puzzle that the official investigators seemed unable or unwilling to see. As she finally emerged from her hiding place, Emily reflected on the peculiar nature of her situation. She had become, in effect, a chronicler of secrets, a keeper of knowledge that could potentially solve one of London's most notorious mysteries. Yet the very information that made her valuable also made her vulnerable, for there were those who would go to great lengths to ensure that certain truths never came to light. The morning was advancing, and with it came the need to focus on the immediate requirements of survival. Emily made her way towards Spitalfields Market, where she might find work carrying baskets or running messages for the vendors. The familiar bustle of commerce would provide both cover and opportunity, allowing her to blend into the crowd while keeping her ears open for useful information. The market was already alive with activity despite the early hour. Costermongers arranged their displays of fruits and vegetables, their voices joining in the ancient chorus of traders calling their wares. The air was thick with the scents of apples and potatoes, fresh bread from the nearby bakeries, and the ever-present undertone of horse manure from the delivery carts that clattered over the cobblestones. Emily found employment with a flower seller named Mrs. Hutchinson, who paid her 3p to help arrange bouquets and carry them to customers throughout the district. The work was pleasant enough, and it provided the perfect excuse to move freely through the streets, while observing the daily rhythms of Whitechapel life. As she worked, Emily noticed the subtle signs of the fear that had settled over the community like a shroud. Conversations ceased abruptly when strangers approached. Women glanced over their shoulders with increasing frequency. Even the children seemed more subdued, staying closer to their parents and avoiding the darkest corners of the alleyways. The flower seller was a kind woman who had known better days, her gentle manner suggesting an education that had somehow led her to this modest trade. She spoke to Emily with a maternal warmth that the girl had rarely experienced, asking about her living arrangements and expressing concern for her welfare. Yet Emily was careful to reveal nothing of her true circumstances, knowing that too much interest from well-meaning adults could prove as dangerous as the attention of those with darker intentions. As the day wore on, Emily found herself thinking repeatedly about the photograph she'd seen pass between the well-dressed man and Polly Palmer. The image represented some form of leverage, a tool that could be used to ensure silence or compliance. But whose face had been captured by the camera's unblinking eye, and what circumstances had led to such a compromising position? The afternoon brought news that sent ripples of fresh terror through the market. Another woman had been found dead in the early hours of the morning, her body discovered in Mitre Square by a police constable making his rounds. The details were still emerging, but already the whispers spoke of mutilations even more savage than those visited upon Annie Chapman. Emily listened to these reports with a mixture of horror and grim satisfaction. Each new atrocity seemed to confirm her growing conviction that the official investigation was pursuing the wrong suspect entirely. The man she had seen was no mad butcher driven by uncontrollable bloodlust, but rather a calculating predator who used the very chaos he helped create to mask his true activities. As evening approached and the market began to wind down its daily business, Emily collected her wages and prepared to face another night in the uncertain world of Whitechapel's lodging houses. The coins in her pouch would secure a bed and perhaps a meal, but they could not purchase the one thing she needed most: the safety that came from being truly invisible. The fog was beginning to roll in from the Thames as Emily made her way through the darkening streets, and with it came the familiar sense of unease that had become her constant companion. Somewhere in these shadows moved a man who had killed at least twice, and who would certainly kill again if his secrets were threatened. The girl carried those secrets now, and with them the terrible burden of knowing that her silence might cost other women their lives, while her speech might well cost her own. Chapter 9. The Watchers in the Walls. The gaslight flickered against the grimy window pane of Mrs. Caldwell's lodging house as Emily pressed her ear to the thin partition wall. 3 weeks had passed since Annie Chapman's death, and the whispers had grown louder in the cramped corridors of Dorset Street. The child had learned to move like smoke through the narrow passages, her bare feet silent on the rotting floorboards, her small frame slipping unnoticed between the shadows cast by oil lamps and dying candles. Mrs. Caldwell's establishment stood hunched between two taller tenements, its 3 stories packed with the desperate and dispossessed of Whitechapel. The building groaned under the weight of too many souls pressed into too few rooms, its walls thin as parchment and just as fragile. Emily had discovered that sound travelled through these walls like water through cloth, carrying conversations from room to room, floor to floor, until the entire structure seemed to breathe with secrets. Through the wall, she could hear the low murmur of Mr. Hennessy's voice. The Irish dock worker had taken the room next to hers only days after Annie's murder, arriving with a canvas bag and the smell of tar still clinging to his clothes. He spoke in whispers to visitors who came in the deep hours before dawn, men whose footsteps she recognised, but whose faces remained hidden in the perpetual twilight of the lodging-house corridors. The autumn rain drummed against the window glass, each drop catching the yellow glow of the street lamp below. October had settled over London like a funeral shroud, bringing with it the familiar sense of coal smoke and unwashed bodies that clung to the narrow streets of the East End. The fog rolled in from the Thames each evening, thick and choking, turning the gaslights into dim halos that cast more shadow than illumination. Emily shifted position carefully, mindful of the loose floorboard beneath her left foot. She had mapped every creak and groan of her tiny room during the sleepless nights that followed Annie's death. The space measured barely 6 feet square, with walls that wept condensation and a ceiling stained black with soot from countless candles. A straw mattress lay in one corner, covered with a threadbare blanket that had once been blue, but now showed the indeterminate colour of age and neglect. The voices through the wall grew clearer as the speakers moved closer to the shared partition. Emily recognised Mr. Hennessy's thick brogue, but the second voice belonged to someone she had heard before, not in the lodging house, but somewhere else, somewhere that made her chest tighten with remembered fear. Mrs. Caldwell kept a different sort of establishment than most in Dorset Street. While other lodging-house keepers packed their buildings with anyone who could scrape together 4pence for a bed, she maintained what she called discretion. Her tenants paid weekly rates that kept the most desperate away, creating a hierarchy of poverty that separated the working poor from the destitute. It was this thin veneer of respectability that had attracted certain visitors who preferred to conduct their business away from the chaos of the common lodging houses. Emily pressed her eye to a crack in the wallpaper where the paste had failed and the edges curled away from the plaster. Through the narrow gap she could see the amber glow of a candle flame dancing across the opposite wall of Hennessy's room. 2 figures sat at a small table, their faces partially obscured by shadows but their postures tense with concentration. The second man wore a dark coat that seemed to absorb the candlelight, and when he turned his head, Emily caught a glimpse of pale skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones. Something about the angle of his jaw, the way he held his shoulders, stirred a memory that made her stomach clench with fear. She had seen this man before, standing in the shadows of the courtyard behind number 29, watching as the police carried Annie's body away on their rough stretcher. The conversation continued in tones too low for clear understanding, but Emily caught fragments that made her blood run cold. Words like the girl and questions drifted through the thin wall, punctuated by longer passages she could not decipher. When the pale man laughed, it sounded like glass breaking in the distance, sharp and brittle against the soft patter of rain on the window. Mrs. Caldwell's establishment attracted a particular clientele precisely because of its location on Dorset Street. The narrow thoroughfare had become infamous throughout London as the worst street in the city, a place where respectability came to die, and secrets could be buried beneath layers of squalor and indifference. Yet it was also a place where information flowed like water, where whispers travelled faster than constables could walk, and where the right word in the right ear could buy safety or silence with equal ease. Emily had learned these lessons in the weeks following Annie's death. The other residents of the lodging house had begun to treat her differently. their conversation stopping when she entered a room, their eyes following her with a mixture of pity and suspicion. She understood that her connection to Annie Chapman, however tenuous, had marked her as something dangerous in their carefully ordered world of survival. The child had been born in the shadow of Christchurch Spitalfields, her earliest memories filled with the sound of bells marking the hours and the smell of hops from the nearby breweries. Her mother had worked in the match factories until the phosphorus poisoned her jaw, leaving Emily to navigate the streets of Whitechapel alone at an age when most children still played with dolls. The workhouse loomed like a spectre over such orphans, but Emily had learned early how to slip between the cracks of official attention, surviving on charity, odd jobs, and the kindness of women like Annie Chapman. Annie had been different from the other unfortunates who haunted the lodging houses of Dorset Street. She carried herself with a dignity that poverty could not entirely strip away, and she possessed a gentleness that seemed out of place in the harsh world of the East End. When she spoke to Emily, which she did whenever their paths crossed, her voice held echoes of better times, of a life before the drink and desperation had claimed her. The conversations through the wall continued for what felt like hours, though Emily knew that time moved differently in the depths of night. The candle flame in Hennessy's room guttered lower, casting longer shadows that seemed to reach through the crack in the wallpaper toward her hiding place. She could feel the cold seeping through the thin glass of her window, carrying with it the perpetual dampness that clung to London's autumn air. During one of the longer silences, Emily heard footsteps in the corridor outside her door. Mrs. Caldwell made her rounds each night, checking that her tenants had paid their weekly dues and ensuring that no unauthorized visitors lingered in the rooms. Her footsteps were distinctive, heavy and deliberate, with a slight drag of her left foot that spoke of an old injury never properly healed. Tonight, however, the footsteps paused outside Emily's door for longer than usual. The child held her breath as the floorboards creaked under Mrs. Caldwell's weight. Through the thin door she could hear the older woman's laboured breathing, the slight wheeze that came from years of breathing the polluted air of the East End. The doorknob rattled softly as if someone were testing whether the door was properly latched, and Emily pressed herself further back into the shadows of her corner. When Mrs. Caldwell finally moved on, her footsteps continuing down the corridor toward the stairs, Emily allowed herself to breathe again. But the brief encounter had left her with a growing sense of unease. The lodging-house keeper had never shown particular interest in her comings and goings before, content to collect her weekly fourpence and ignore her presence. The change in behaviour suggested that someone had been asking questions, and Emily knew with a certainty born of street wisdom that those questions concerned her. The voices through the wall had fallen silent while Mrs. Caldwell made her rounds, but now they resumed with renewed urgency. Emily could hear the scrape of chair legs against floorboards as one of the men rose from the table. Through her spy hole in the wallpaper, she watched as the pale man moved to the window, his silhouette black against the gaslight from the street below. When he spoke again, his voice carried more clearly through the thin partition. The words chilled Emily to her core, confirming her worst fears about the attention she had drawn. The man spoke of watching, of waiting, of opportunities that would arise when the child was alone and vulnerable. He described her daily routines with an accuracy that made her realise she had been under observation for weeks, her movements tracked and catalogued by someone who meant her harm. The autumn wind picked up outside, rattling the window frame and sending a cold draft through the gaps around the glass. Emily pulled her thin blanket more tightly around her shoulders, but the chill she felt came from within rather than without. She understood now that her questions about Annie Chapman, her persistence in seeking answers about the woman's death, had attracted attention from people who preferred their secrets to remain buried. Hennessy's visitor prepared to leave, gathering his coat from the back of his chair and moving toward the door. Emily could hear the soft clink of coins changing hands, the sound of payment for services that she dared not contemplate. As the pale man's footsteps faded down the corridor, she remained pressed against the wall, her ear straining to catch any final words that might give her advance warning of what was to come. The lodging house settled into the restless quiet of deep night, but Emily knew that sleep would not come easily. Outside her window, the fog continued to thicken, turning the familiar streets of Whitechapel into an alien landscape of shadows and whispers. Somewhere in that maze of narrow alleys and crumbling tenements, forces were moving that would soon converge upon her small room and the secrets she carried about Annie Chapman's final days. As the candle in Hennessy's room finally guttered out, plunging both spaces into darkness, Emily closed her eyes and tried to remember Annie's voice, the gentle words of encouragement the woman had offered during their brief encounters. Those memories would have to sustain her through whatever trials lay ahead, for she understood now that the watchers in the walls were preparing to step into the light. Chapter 10: The Silence That Follows. The bells of Christ Church, Spitalfields, had ceased their morning toll when Inspector Frederick Chandler made his final notation in the Chapman case file. November rain drummed against the windows of Commercial Street Police Station, each droplet carrying with it the weight of autumn's deepening grip on the East End. The gaslight flickered against the yellowed pages of his report, casting dancing shadows across words that would soon be filed away in the archives, joining the countless other mysteries that London's fog had claimed. Emily Hartwell stood at the window of the Whitechapel Union workhouse, her breath forming small clouds against the cold glass. 3 months had passed since that September morning, when Annie Chapman's life had ended in the courtyard behind Dorset Street, yet the child's memories remained as sharp as winter frost. The workhouse matrons had found her wandering the streets 2 days after the murder, clutching a small leather pouch that contained nothing more than a few bent pennies and a faded ribbon. The official records would show that Emily Hartwell was an orphan of unknown parentage, taken into the care of the parish after being discovered in a state of distress following the Whitechapel murders. No mention was made of the questions she had asked about Annie Chapman, nor of the strange tales she had whispered to other children in the dormitory after the candles were extinguished. The adults who ran the workhouse believed that children's memories were malleable things, easily shaped by fear and imagination into stories that bore little resemblance to truth. But Emily remembered everything. She remembered the man who had visited Annie Chapman on the nights when the fog rolled thickest through Dorset Street. Not the rough clients who came seeking momentary comfort in exchange for a few coins, but another figure entirely. A gentleman, Emily had thought then, though she had learned since that gentlemen could be the most dangerous of all. He wore a dark coat that reached nearly to his ankles, and his footsteps on the wooden stairs were always careful and measured, as if he were counting each one. Most clearly she remembered his face. It was not the face of madness that the newspapers had conjured when they spoke of Jack the Ripper. This man's features held a terrible clarity, as if he saw the world with a precision that normal people could not bear. His eyes, when they had briefly met hers through the crack in Annie's door, had contained no wildness, no frenzy. Instead, they had held the cold patience of winter itself. The last time Emily had seen him, he had been ascending the stairs to Annie's room on the night before her death. The child had hidden in the shadows of the landing, pressed against the wall like a moth seeking darkness. She had heard voices through the thin door, Annie's familiar tone mingled with the stranger's cultured accent. There had been no shouting, no struggle, only quiet conversation that had continued well into the small hours, punctuated occasionally by the clink of coins. When morning came, Annie Chapman was gone, and the man had vanished like mist before dawn. Inspector Chandler closed the case file and rubbed his tired eyes. The official investigation had followed every lead, interviewed every witness, examined every piece of evidence. The coroner's inquest had concluded that Annie Chapman had died at the hands of person, or persons unknown. Most likely the same individual responsible for the murder of Mary Ann Nichols weeks earlier. The press had embraced the name Jack the Ripper with ghoulish enthusiasm, and the public's imagination had run wild with theories about the identity of the Whitechapel murderer. But Chandler knew, as all experienced investigators knew, that the most obvious explanation was rarely the correct one. The Chapman murder bore similarities to the Nichols killing, certainly, but there were differences too. Subtle variations in method, in the positioning of the body, in the items left behind. These discrepancies suggested either a killer who was evolving his technique, or perhaps multiple perpetrators working in the same area during the same period. The inspector had followed this second theory as far as the evidence would allow. His inquiries had led him to examine the backgrounds of several men who'd been seen in the vicinity of Dorset Street during the relevant time period. One name had appeared repeatedly in witness statements, though never with enough detail to warrant an arrest. A well-dressed gentleman who seemed to know the area intimately despite his obvious wealth and education. Dr. Marcus Whitmore had been easy enough to identify once Chandler had applied proper investigative methods. The physician maintained a practice in Harley Street, specialising in diseases of the mind. His credentials were impeccable, his reputation spotless. When questioned, he had admitted to conducting research in the East End, studying the effects of poverty and vice on the human constitution. Such work, he explained, required him to venture into areas where respectable society feared to tread. The doctor's alibi for the morning of September 8th had been airtight. Multiple witnesses could attest to his presence at a medical conference in Edinburgh, where he had delivered a paper on the treatment of hysteria in female patients. The timestamps on hotel registers and railway tickets confirmed his story beyond any reasonable doubt. Yet something in the man's manner had troubled Chandler. There had been a quality to Dr. Whitmore's responses, a precision that seemed almost rehearsed. When pressed about his specific research methodology in the East End, the doctor had grown evasive, claiming that his work involved confidential medical observations that could not be disclosed without violating his professional oath. The trail had ended there, blocked by the immutable barriers of medical privilege and social position. Without concrete evidence linking Dr. Whitmore to any crime, Chandler could pursue the matter no further. The physician continued his rounds, his research, his respectable life among London's professional classes. Christmas approached with unusual severity that year. Snow fell early and stayed late, blanketing the city in a white shroud that muffled sound and softened the harsh edges of poverty. The Whitechapel murders had faded from the front pages of newspapers, replaced by newer scandals and fresher horrors. Life in the East End continued its grinding rhythm of survival and desperation, marked now by an additional wariness when darkness fell. Emily Hartwell had adapted to workhouse life with the resilience that children possess when faced with circumstances beyond their control. She attended lessons with the other parish children, learning to read and write with an aptitude that impressed her teachers. During the long winter evenings, she would sit by the small fire in the common room, listening to the older girls tell stories of their former lives. But at night, when the dormitory fell silent except for the sound of sleeping breath and shifting straw mattresses, Emily would lie awake and remember. She would recall Annie Chapman's kindness, the woman's gentle voice when she had sung old ballads to chase away the darkness. She would think of the coins Annie had pressed into her small palm, always accompanied by a warning to spend them carefully and save what she could. Most of all, she would remember the face at Annie's door on that final night. The cold eyes that had met hers across the narrow landing, and the slight nod the man had given her before disappearing into Annie's room. It had been a gesture of acknowledgement, she realised now. He had known she was watching, and he had not cared. Spring came late to London that year, arriving reluctantly through grey skies and persistent drizzle. The workhouse children were permitted occasional walks through the surrounding streets, always under strict supervision and never venturing far from the institution's protective walls. During one such outing, Emily found herself passing through Dorset Street. The lodging house where she'd lived with Annie Chapman had been demolished, replaced by a newer structure that housed twice as many people in the same cramped space. The courtyard where Annie's body had been discovered was now covered by cobblestones worn smooth by countless feet, showing no trace of the violence that had occurred there. Emily stood at the spot where she calculated Annie had fallen, feeling the weight of memory settle around her like a familiar cloak. The other children continued their walk under the watchful eyes of the workhouse matrons, but Emily remained motionless, her gaze fixed on the unremarkable ground beneath her feet. That was when she saw him again. Dr. Whitmore stood in the shadows of an alleyway across the street, his dark coat unchanged from that night 9 months ago. His face wore the same expression of clinical observation, as if he were studying a particularly interesting specimen. When he noticed Emily's attention, he did not flee or attempt to hide. Instead, he stepped forward into the pale sunlight, his movements deliberate and unhurried. For a moment, child and man regarded each other across the narrow street. Emily felt her heart beating rapidly against her ribs, yet she found herself unable to look away. There was something hypnotic about the doctor's presence, a quality that demanded attention even as it inspired fear. Dr. Whitmore raised one gloved hand in what might have been a greeting or perhaps a farewell. Then he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing against the brick walls until they faded into the general noise of the city. Emily never saw him again. The official records of the Whitechapel murders would eventually fill several volumes, stored in the archives of Scotland Yard alongside thousands of other case files. Scholars and amateur investigators would pore over these documents for generations, seeking patterns and connections that might finally reveal the identity of Jack the Ripper. But the name of Dr. Marcus Whitmore would appear only in passing, mentioned as one of many individuals questioned during the course of the investigation. Inspector Chandler retired from the Metropolitan Police in 1895, carrying with him the frustration of unsolved cases and unanswered questions. He had learned to live with uncertainty, accepting that not every mystery could be unravelled, not every criminal brought to justice. The Chapman murder remained among his most troubling failures, a reminder of the limitations that constrained even the most dedicated investigators. Emily Hartwell left the workhouse on her 16th birthday, equipped with basic literacy and a reference letter that would help her secure employment as a domestic servant. She found work in a respectable household in Bloomsbury, far from the narrow streets and desperate lodging houses of her childhood. She never spoke of Annie Chapman or of the events that had led to her placement in parish care. But sometimes, during the long London winters when fog rolled thick through the city streets, Emily would stand at her bedroom window and remember a woman's kindness in the midst of cruelty. She would think of pennies pressed into small hands, of lullabies sung in the darkness, of love offered freely despite the hardships of life, and occasionally, when the mist was particularly dense and the gaslight created strange shadows on the walls, she would remember a face watching from the darkness. Cold eyes that had seen too much, understood too well, and chosen their path with the terrible certainty of winter frost. The fog continued to roll through London's streets, carrying with it the secrets of the past and the mysteries of the present. Some stories ended with revelation and justice, but others simply faded into silence, becoming part of the city's vast collection of untold tales. Annie Chapman's true killer walked among London's respectable citizens until old age finally claimed him, carrying his secrets to a well-appointed grave in Highgate Cemetery. The inscription on his headstone praised his contributions to medical science and his dedication to helping society's most vulnerable members. The candle burned low, the chamber fell silent, and history, once again, turned the page in the dark.